There's nothing quite like the bond between a person and their dog. That unconditional love that asks for nothing, but gives everything in return. When that trust is broken by something beyond our understanding, it shakes us to our very core. Ruth McKinley had seen plenty of sick animals in her 20 years volunteering at the Seaside Animal Clinic. But when fisherman Tom Bradley carried his rescue dog Chester through the doors that Tuesday morning, something was different. The dog had a strange circular wound on his back, pulsing with tiny black nodules that seemed to move on their own. Ruth, a retired science teacher, recognized the pattern from somewhere deep in her past, a classified government file she'd glimpsed decades ago. As more animals in their coastal town began showing similar symptoms, Ruth realized this wasn't just a medical mystery. It was something far more dangerous, something that should have stayed buried. What exactly had Chester picked up, and why did it feel like her quiet town was about to become ground zero for something terrible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt air carried the familiar scent of kelp and weathered wood as Ruth McKinley made her way down Harbor Street toward the Seaside Animal Clinic. At 72, she still moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent decades commanding the attention of restless teenagers, though her steps were more measured now, each one deliberate and thoughtful. The morning fog clung to the Victorian houses that lined the street, their painted shutters and flower boxes creating a postcard-perfect scene that had drawn tourists to Millfield Harbor for generations. Ruth paused at the corner of Harbor and Main, her weathered hand gripping the strap of her canvas bag a little tighter than usual. She hadn't slept well. Chester's wound kept replaying in her mind like a film reel stuck on repeat. The perfect circle, the way those tiny black nodules seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, it stirred something in her memory that she'd tried to bury 47 years ago. The bell above the clinic door chimed as she entered, and the familiar chaos of morning appointments greeted her. Mrs. Patterson sat in the corner with her ancient tabby, Mr. Whiskers, while young Jimmy Santos held a carrier containing what sounded like a very upset parakeet. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and nervous animals, a combination that had become as comforting to Ruth as her morning coffee. "You're early today," Dr. Sarah Chun called from behind the reception desk, her dark hair pulled back in its usual efficient ponytail. At 38, Sarah had the kind of steady competence that reminded Ruth of her best students, the ones who asked the right questions and never settled for easy answers. She'd taken over the practice from Dr. Morrison 3 years ago, and Ruth had been volunteering here ever since her retirement from Millfield High. Couldn't sleep, Ruth admitted, settling behind the desk to help with the morning check-ins. "Keep thinking about that dog yesterday, Chester." Sarah's expression grew. "Serious. I've been thinking about him too. I've never seen anything quite like that wound pattern. The tissue around it was inflamed, but in such a specific way. Almost like," she paused, searching for the right words, "like something was directing the inflammation." Ruth's hand stilled over the appointment book. Directing it? I know how that sounds. But the cellular response was too organized, too purposeful for a typical infection or injury. "I took some tissue samples last night. I'm hoping the lab can tell us more." The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of checkups and vaccinations, but Ruth found herself distracted. Between appointments, she found herself pulling out her old teaching journal, a leather-bound notebook she'd kept for over 30 years. Its pages were filled with lesson plans, student observations, and the kind of scientific curiosities that had made her classroom legendary among Millfield High alumni. She flipped through pages of biology notes, sketches of cellular structures, and observations about the natural world around their coastal town. Ruth had always encouraged her students to look beyond the obvious, to question what they saw and dig deeper. Science isn't about memorizing facts. she used to tell them. It's about understanding the patterns that connect everything together. Patterns. That word again. During lunch break, she found herself in the clinic's small break room with Sarah, picking at a sandwich while the younger woman reviewed Chester's file. Tom Bradley's been bringing strays to us for years, Sarah mused, reading. Through the notes. Always finds them in the most unlikely places. This time, he said Chester was half dead on that stretch of beach near Gull Point. Gull Point? Ruth looked up sharply. That's near the old research station. What research station? Ruth hesitated. It had been so many years since anyone had even mentioned the facility. Back in the 70s, there was a marine biology research station out there, funded by some government agency. It closed down suddenly. I think it was 78 or 79. The buildings are still there. Far as I know, just abandoned. Sarah leaned forward with interest. What kind of research? I was never entirely sure. They kept to themselves, brought in a lot of equipment, had some very serious-looking people in suits visiting regularly. Ruth closed her journal, her fingers, tracing its worn edges. I was young then, just starting my teaching career. A friend of mine, another biology teacher from the university, got recruited for some kind of consultation work there. She was excited about it at first, said it was cutting-edge marine ecosystem research. What happened to her? The project ended abruptly. She never talked about what she'd worked on, and whenever I asked, she'd change the subject. A few years later, she moved across the country. We lost touch. Ruth took a sip of her tea, remembering the strange look in her friend's eyes during their last conversation. She seemed frightened, Sarah, like she'd seen something that shook her to her core. The afternoon brought more routine appointments, but Ruth's mind kept wandering. As she helped restrain a nervous terrier for its vaccinations, she found herself studying its eyes, looking for any sign of the unusual. When Mrs. Henderson brought in her elderly beagle for a checkup, Ruth examined its coat more carefully than usual, searching for any anomalies. It was nearly closing time when Tom Bradley returned. He pushed through the clinic door with the careful movement of a man who'd spent 68 years hauling fishing nets and battling ocean storms. His weathered face carried the permanent squint of someone who'd stared into too many sunrises over the water, and his hands bore the scars and calluses of honest work. Chester limped beside him, the bandage on his back visible beneath his shaggy coat. "How's our patient doing?" Sarah asked, kneeling to examine Chester's wound. "Better, I think," Tom replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Eating well. Seems more alert. But there's something—" He glanced at Ruth, then back at Sarah. "This morning, when I was cleaning his water bowl, I noticed something strange. The water had this shimmer to it, like there was oil floating on the surface, but it wasn't oil." Sarah frowned, carefully peeling back the bandage. The wound looked smaller than yesterday, but those black nodules were still there. And if anything, they seemed more active, pulsing in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. "Tom," Ruth said carefully, "you mentioned you found Chester near Gull Point. Can you be more specific about the location?" The old fisherman nodded. "About half a mile south of the point, where those old concrete structures stick out into the water. You know, the spot where the cormorants like to roost." Chester was lying on the rocks, just above the tide line, barely breathing. Figured he'd been washed ashore during the storm 2 weeks back. Ruth exchanged a meaningful look with Sarah. The old research station was less than a mile from that location. "Has Chester been back to that area since you brought him home?" Sarah asked. "No, but—" Tom hesitated. "But I've noticed something odd. Other animals in the neighborhood seem drawn to him. Mrs. Patterson's cat has been sitting outside my fence for days just staring at Chester through the yard. And yesterday, I found 3 gulls perched on my roof, all facing the same direction, toward where Chester was lying in the sun." As they spoke, Ruth found herself studying Chester more intently. Despite his apparent improvement, there was something different about the dog's demeanor. His eyes held an alertness that seemed almost too keen, too focused. When he looked at her, she had the unsettling feeling that he was assessing her, measuring her in some way that had nothing to do with typical canine behavior. "I'd like to keep monitoring Chester closely over the next few days," Sarah told Tom. "Would it be possible for you to bring him in daily?" "Just for quick checkups, of course, whatever he needs." Tom's affection for the rescue dog was evident in every word. He's been through enough already. After Tom and Chester left, Ruth and Sarah stood in the empty waiting room, the weight of unspoken concerns hanging between them. "Ruth," Sarah said quietly, "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 15 years. I've seen infections, parasites, genetic disorders, and injuries I couldn't have imagined. But this," she gestured toward where Chester had been standing, "this feels different. Those nodules aren't behaving like any biological material I've ever encountered." Ruth nodded slowly. "I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed. And Sarah, I think we need to keep this between us for now." "Why?" Ruth looked out the window toward the harbor, where the fishing boats were returning with their daily catch. The normalcy of the scene, the gulls wheeling overhead, the tourists browsing the shops along the wharf, the children feeding the seals from the dock felt precious and fragile, because 47 years ago, I saw something in a government file that I wasn't supposed to see. Something that looked exactly like what's growing on Chester's back. And the people involved in that research made it very clear that some knowledge was too dangerous to share. As they locked up the clinic and went their separate ways, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet, coastal town was about to become the center of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple veterinary mystery. The fog was rolling in from the ocean, shrouding the familiar landmarks in gray uncertainty. And for the first time in years, Millfield Harbor felt like a place where secrets might be keeping dangerous company with the tide. Ruth lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom as rain drummed against the windows. The sound should have been soothing. She'd always loved the rhythm of storms, rolling in from the Atlantic, but tonight it only amplified her restlessness. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those pulsing black nodules, and with them came memories she'd spent decades trying to forget. She finally gave up on sleep at 3 in the morning, padding to her kitchen in her worn slippers to make tea. As the kettle heated, she found herself drawn to the old wooden chest in her study, the one that held remnants from her early career. Teaching awards, photographs from school field trips, and buried beneath it all, a manila folder she hadn't opened in 20 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the folder. Inside, yellowed with age, was a single torn page, all that remained of something she'd been ordered to forget. The paper bore the letterhead of a company she'd never heard of before or since, Meridian Biological Solutions. Below that, a series of diagrams showing cellular structures that looked disturbingly familiar. The memory came flooding back. With painful clarity, it was the summer of 1978, and Ruth had just completed her master's degree in marine biology. She was 25, ambitious, and desperately hoping to make enough money to pay off her student loans before starting her teaching career in the fall. When Dr. Marcus Webb approached her about temporary work at a research facility near the coast, it seemed like an answer to her prayers. Webb had been her professor for advanced cellular biology, a brilliant but intense man who demanded perfection from his students. He was perhaps 10 years older than Ruth, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to catalog and analyze everything they saw. His offer was vague but well paid. Assist with marine organism research at a private facility for 6 weeks, with the understanding that all work would be confidential. The research station at Gull Point was unlike anything Ruth had expected. From the outside, it looked like a standard marine biology laboratory, but inside, The security was more suited to a military installation. Every room required keycard access, and certain areas were completely off-limits to temporary staff like herself. Her job was to catalog and analyze tissue samples from various marine organisms, fish, crustaceans, mollusks, even some deep-sea specimens she couldn't identify. But after 2 weeks, she began to notice disturbing patterns. Many of the organisms showed signs of modification, genetic alterations that shouldn't occur naturally. Cellular structures that seemed too organized, too purposeful. The breakthrough came during her 3rd week, when she was assigned to process a batch of samples from what Webb called field test subjects. Under a microscope, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Tiny black nodules embedded in the tissue, pulsing with their own internal rhythm. They weren't parasites or tumors. They were something else entirely. Something artificial. She'd made the mistake of asking questions. "Dr. Webb," she'd said, catching him as he reviewed data in the main laboratory. "These nodules in the latest samples, what are they exactly?" Webb's expression had shifted from mild interest to sharp attention. "What have you observed about them?" "They appear to be synthetic. The cellular structure is too regular, too organized, and they seem to be networked somehow. When I stimulate one, the others respond." Ruth had been excited by the scientific implications, naive about the larger picture. Are we studying some kind of biosensor technology? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Webb closed his notebook and looked at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Miss McKinley, you were hired to catalog specimens, not to theorize about their nature or purpose. I suggest you limit your observations to basic data collection." But Ruth's curiosity had been ignited. Over the next few days, she secretly made copies of her most interesting findings, including detailed drawings of the nodule structures. She told herself she was simply building her research portfolio, but deep down, she knew something was wrong with the entire project. The end came suddenly. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 47 years ago today, she realized with a chill Ruth arrived at the facility to find it in chaos. Military personnel were everywhere, packing equipment and shredding documents. Webb was nowhere to be seen. A man in an expensive suit had intercepted her at the door. "Miss McKinley? I'm Agent Harrison with the Department of Health and Human Services. I need to speak with you immediately." The conversation that followed changed Ruth's life. Agent Harrison explained that the research project had been discontinued due to ethical concerns, and that all materials related to it were now classified. Ruth was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement and surrender any notes or documents she might have taken. She'd handed over most of her materials, but had managed to keep one page, the diagram of the nodules, hidden in her personal notebook. Harrison had made it clear that discussing the project with anyone would result in serious legal consequences. "Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, Miss McKinley," he'd said. "What you've seen here could cause panic if misunderstood." Then public isn't ready for certain scientific advances. Ruth had left that day shaken to her core, but she'd convinced herself that the agents were right. The research was over, the facility was closed, and she had a teaching career to begin. She'd buried the memory and the torn page, focusing on educating young minds about the wonders of the natural world instead. Now, sitting in her kitchen with that yellowed page spread before her, Ruth realized how naive she'd been. The research hadn't ended. It had just moved somewhere else. The diagrams on the page matched Chester's condition perfectly. The same nodules, the same pulsing pattern, the same organized cellular response she'd observed 4 decades ago. But how was that possible? Webb would be in his 70s by now, if he was still alive. And the government had shut down the project. Unless they hadn't by dawn, Ruth had made her decision. She needed to see Chester again. needed to examine those nodules more carefully. And she needed to find out if Dr. Marcus Webb was still conducting research somewhere in the shadows. At 7 a.m., she called the clinic. "Sarah, it's Ruth. I need to ask you a favor. When Tom brings Chester in today, could you take additional tissue samples? I want to run some tests of my own." "What kind of tests?" Sarah's voice was cautious but interested. "I have a friend at the university, someone with access to more sophisticated equipment than what we have at the clinic. I think we need to understand exactly what those nodules are made of." There was a pause. "Ruth, is there something you're not telling me about Chester's condition?" Ruth looked down at the diagram spread across her kitchen table, at the evidence of a secret she'd kept for nearly 5 decades. "Yes," she said quietly, "there is. But I need to be sure before I can explain. Can you trust me on this?" "Of course. But Ruth, be careful. Whatever this is, it feels bigger than a sick dog." As Ruth hung up the phone, she knew Sarah was right. Chester's appearance in their quiet town wasn't random. It was the beginning of something that had been building for 47 years. And she was the only one who understood what they might be facing. The rain had stopped, and morning light was filtering through her windows, illuminating the torn page with its ominous diagrams. Ruth carefully folded the paper and slipped it into her purse. After decades of keeping secrets, it was time to start seeking answers. But first, she needed to understand exactly what had followed Chester home from that beach near Gull Point and why it felt like something that had been waiting for her all along. Ruth arrived at the clinic before 8, her nerves humming with anticipation and dread. She'd spent the remainder of the morning poring over the torn page, trying to remember every detail from that summer 47 years ago. The more she studied the diagrams, the more convinced she became that Chester's condition was no accident. Sarah was already preparing for the day's appointments when Ruth walked in, carrying a small cooler that would keep tissue samples stable for transport to the university lab. "Any word from Tom about bringing Chester in?" Ruth asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "He should be here within the hour," Sarah replied, then paused in her preparation to study Ruth's face. "You look like you didn't sleep much." "I didn't." Ruth set down her bag and moved to help with the morning setup. "Sarah, when Tom gets here, I'd like to ask him some specific questions about where he found Chester. The exact location might be important." Before Sarah could respond, the clinic door chimed, and Tom Bradley entered with Chester at his side. The dog looked stronger than he had the previous day, but Ruth noticed something else that made her stomach clench. Chester moved with a purposefulness that seemed almost human-like in its intention. "Morning, ladies," Tom said, settling into the examination room chair. "Chester's been eager to get here today. Strangest thing, he started heading toward town before I even got his leash." Ruth exchanged a glance with Sarah. "Tom, I'd like to go over the details of where you found Chester again. It might help us understand his condition better." Tom nodded, scratching Chester behind the ears. "Sure thing. It was about 2 weeks ago, after that big storm we had. I was checking my crab trap south of Gull Point. You know, the area where those old concrete structures jut out into the water." "The structures from the old research station?" Ruth prompted. "That's right. Ugly things, but the crabs like to hide around them." Tom's weather-beaten face creased with concentration. Chester was lying on the rocks about 50 yards from the biggest structure, the one that looks like it might have been some kind of platform or dock. Poor thing was barely breathing, soaked through, and he had that wound already. Ruth felt her pulse quicken. "The wound was already there when you found him." "Oh yes, fresh though. Still bleeding a bit. I figured he'd tangled with something in the water shark, maybe, or got caught on some debris during the storm." Sarah began her examination of Chester, carefully removing the bandage to examine the wound. Ruth leaned in close, studying the pattern of black nodules Under the clinic's bright lights, she could see that they'd grown slightly since yesterday, and their pulsing seemed more synchronized. "Tom," Ruth said carefully, "have you been back to that area since you found Chester?" "Once, about a week ago." "Why? Did you notice anything unusual?" Tom considered this. "Now that you mention it, yes. The water around those old structures was different, had this strange shimmer to it, like when oil spills, but not quite the same. And the marine life was odd too. Saw a whole school of fish swimming in perfect formation, like they were following some kind of pattern." Ruth's hands tightened on her notebook. "What kind of pattern?" "Hard to describe. Like they were all moving to the same rhythm, turning at the exact same moment. Never seen anything like it in 50 years of fishing these waters." As Sarah took tissue samples from Chester's wound, Ruth found herself studying the dog's behavior more closely. He sat perfectly still during the procedure, showing none of the anxiety or discomfort that most animals exhibited during medical examinations. His dark eyes seemed to track their movements with uncanny intelligence. "Sarah," Ruth said quietly, "have you noticed how calm Chester is? Most dogs would be showing some stress by now." Sarah nodded, her expression troubled. "It's unusual. Almost like he understands what we're doing and why." After Tom and Chester left, Ruth and Sarah stood in the examination room, both lost in thought. The tissue samples were secured in Ruth's cooler, ready for transport to the university. But the implications of what they'd learned from Tom were weighing heavily on both women. "Ruth," Sarah said finally, "those old structures Tom mentioned, do you know what they were used for?" "Docking facilities for research vessels, mostly. The marine station brought in equipment and personnel by boat. But Sarah, there's something else." Ruth hesitated, then pulled out her notebook and showed Sarah the torn page with its faded diagrams. "I need to tell you about the summer of 1978. As Ruth recounted her experience at the research facility, Sarah's expression grew increasingly grave. When Ruth finished, they sat in silence for several minutes. "You think Chester was deliberately infected?" Sarah asked. "I think Chester was a test subject who escaped that storm 2 weeks ago and might have damaged whatever containment they were using. Chester could have been washed ashore from a facility we don't even know exists." Sarah studied the diagrams more closely. "These nodules, you said they seemed networked when you observed them 47 years ago. They responded to stimulation in coordinated patterns, almost like they were communicating with each other." Ruth pointed to specific details on the page. "And look at this notation here. Data collection and transmission capabilities. I didn't understand what that meant at the time. Data collection from what?" "From the host organism. The nodules were designed to monitor and record biological processes, heart rate, brain activity, cellular function, immune responses. They were essentially biological surveillance devices. The implications hung in the air between them. If Chester was carrying active biosurveillance technology, who was receiving the data, and what did they plan to do with it?" "We need more information," Sarah said decisively, "about the current status of that research facility, about who might be continuing this work, and about whether there are other animals like Chester out there." Ruth nodded. "I have a contact at the university who might be able to help us analyze these samples without asking too many questions. But Sarah, if I'm right about what this is, we could be dealing with something much larger than veterinary medicine." "What do you mean?" Ruth looked out the window toward the harbor, where fishing boats were preparing for their daily runs. "If someone is still conducting this research, and if they're testing it on animals in the wild, then Chester might just be the beginning. Those coordinated fish movements Tom described, the strange shimmer in the water near the facility. What if the biosensors aren't limited to individual animals?" Sarah's face paled. "You think they're testing ecosystem-wide surveillance?" I think we need to find out exactly what happened to that research program 47 years ago, and who's been continuing it in the shadows." Ruth closed her notebook, her expression grim but determined. Because if Chester wandered into town, carrying active surveillance technology, then someone knows exactly where he is, and they know that we've been examining him. As if summoned by their conversation, Ruth's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Dr. McKinley? The voice was elderly but sharp, carrying the weight of authority. "This is Dr. Harrison. I believe we need to talk." Ruth's hand trembled as she held the phone. Dr. Harrison, the federal agent who had ended her involvement in the research project 47 years ago, was calling her. After nearly 5 decades of silence. "Dr. Harrison," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't sure you were still alive?" "I am, though I sometimes wonder if that's a blessing or a curse." His voice carried the weight of advanced age, but none of the infirmity. "We need to meet Dr. McKinley, privately. There are developments you need to understand." "What kind of developments?" "The kind that involve a certain rescue dog and patterns you might recognize from your past." "Can you meet me at the old lighthouse on Beacon Hill at 7 this evening?" "Come alone." The line went dead before Ruth could respond. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. "Ruth?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. Who was that? Someone from my past. Someone who shouldn't know about Chester. Ruth sat down the phone and looked at Sarah with growing urgency. "We need to accelerate our investigation. I'm going to take these samples to the university right now. While I'm gone, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Contact Martha Greaves at the weather station. Ask her if she's noticed any unusual electromagnetic readings over the past 2 weeks, specifically around the time of that storm." Ruth gathered the tissue samples and her notes. "And Sarah?" "If anyone comes asking about Chester or our examination of him, you haven't seen anything unusual, just routine veterinary care." An hour later, Ruth was sitting across from Dr. Jennifer Walsh in the marine biology lab at Coastal University. Jennifer was one of Ruth's former students, now a respected researcher in her own right, and one of the few people Ruth trusted with sensitive inquiries. "These tissue samples are remarkable, Ruth," Jennifer said, looking up from her microscopic examination. "I've never seen anything quite like these structures. They appear to be synthetic, but they're interfacing with the host tissue in ways that suggest advanced bioengineering. Can you determine what they're designed to do?" Jennifer made some adjustments to the microscope and stepped back. "Take a look at this." Ruth peered into the eyepiece and gasped. The nodules were clearly visible, but now she could see thread-like connections extending from each one into the surrounding tissue. The threads pulsed with tiny electrical impulses, creating a network that spread throughout the sample. "They're monitoring everything," Jennifer continued. "Neural activity, cellular, metabolism, immune responses. These devices are recording comprehensive biological data, but that's not the most interesting part." She led Ruth to another piece of equipment, a sophisticated signal analyzer. "I detected electromagnetic emissions from the samples. Very low frequency, but definitely artificial. These nodules aren't just collecting data. They're transmitting it." Ruth felt the room spin slightly. Transmitting to what? Unknown. But the signal strength suggests they're designed to communicate with a central receiver within a few miles radius. Jennifer's expression was grave. "Ruth, this technology is decades ahead of anything in the published literature. Where did you get these samples?" Before Ruth could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. 3 more animals brought in today with similar wounds. Need you back at clinic ASAP." Ruth's blood ran cold. The situation was escalating faster than she'd anticipated. "Jennifer, I need you to run every test you can on these samples, but I need your discretion." Don't log them in your official records, and don't discuss this with anyone else. This is connected to something dangerous, isn't it? Ruth nodded grimly. More dangerous than you can imagine. She drove back to Millfield Harbor with growing dread, her mind cataloging the implications. If 3 more animals were showing similar symptoms, the spread was accelerating. And if Dr. Harrison was reaching out after decades of silence, it meant the situation had attracted federal attention once again. The clinic was in controlled chaos when Ruth arrived. 3 worried pet owners sat in the waiting room, each with an animal showing the distinctive circular wounds. Sarah met her at the door, her face pale with concern. Mrs. Patterson's cat, the Henderson's beagle, and a stray that someone found near the marina this morning, Sarah reported quietly. All showing the same nodule pattern as Chester, but these wounds look more advanced. Ruth examined each animal. Her worst fears confirmed. The nodules in these newer cases were larger, more active, and showed signs of the thread-like neural connections she'd observed under Jennifer's microscope. Sarah, we need to call Martha Greaves right now. Martha answered. On the second ring, Ruth, I was just about to call you. The electromagnetic readings I've been getting are off the charts. Started about 2 weeks ago, right around the time of that big storm. What kind of readings? Coordinated pulses, very low frequency, emanating from somewhere offshore. At first, I thought it might be interference from marine equipment, but the pattern is too regular, too organized. It's like something is broadcasting a signal every few minutes. Ruth closed her eyes, the pieces falling into place. Martha, are the pulses getting stronger? Yes, and more frequent. Whatever is generating them is either getting more powerful or moving closer to shore. After ending the call, Ruth turned to Sarah with grim determination. I need to meet with someone this evening, someone who might have answers about what we're dealing with. But first, we need to make a decision about these infected animals. What kind of decision? Whether to report this to the authorities or try to handle it ourselves. Ruth looked around the clinic at the evidence of a spreading infection that seemed designed for surveillance and control. If we report it, this will become a federal matter within hours. The animals will be confiscated, the town might be quarantined, and we'll lose any chance of understanding what's really happening. And if we don't report it, then we're on our own against technology and people who have been perfecting this system for 47 years. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the sleeping animals in their recovery cages. What do you think is the right thing to do? Ruth thought about Chester, about Tom Bradley's devotion to his rescue dog, about the trust the community placed in their small clinic. Then she thought about Dr. Harrison's phone call and the ominous implications of surveillance, technology being tested on innocent animals. I think we need to understand what we're fighting before we call for help. But Sarah, if you want out of this, I'll understand. This could get very dangerous very quickly. Sarah's response was immediate and firm. I became a veterinarian too. Protect animals. If something is using them as unwilling test subjects, then I'm staying to fight it. As evening approached and Ruth prepared to meet Dr. Harrison, both women understood that their quiet coastal town had become the epicenter of something that reached far beyond veterinary medicine. The question was whether they would be able to stop it before it spread beyond their ability to contain. The old lighthouse on Beacon Hill had been abandoned for 30 years, its white paint peeling and its light long since replaced by modern navigation systems. Ruth climbed the winding path as dusk settled over Millfield Harbor, her flashlight casting nervous shadows on the overgrown trail. She'd told Sarah she would call every hour, and if she missed a check-in, Sarah was to contact the state police immediately. Dr. Harrison was waiting for her at the base of the lighthouse, and Ruth was shocked by how much he'd aged. The authoritative federal agent she remembered from 1978 was now a frail man in his 80s, leaning heavily on a walking cane. but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had intimidated her all those years ago. "Dr. McKinley," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be difficult. Dr. Harrison, or is it Agent Harrison? Just Harold now. I retired from government service 25 years ago, but some responsibilities never end." He gestured toward a bench that had been placed near the lighthouse door. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." As they settled on the bench, Harold pulled a battered manila folder from his coat. The sight of it made Ruth's stomach clench. It looked exactly like the files from the research station. "You kept records," Ruth said. "I kept everything. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence from Project Tidepool, because I knew this day would come." Harold opened the folder, revealing pages of documents marked with various classification stamps. Project Tidepool was officially terminated in 1978, Harold continued, his voice heavy with regret. But the termination was a lie. Dr. Marcus Webb had convinced certain elements within the military-industrial complex that his biosurveillance technology could revolutionize intelligence gathering. Instead of shutting down the project, they moved it offshore. Ruth leaned forward, studying the documents. "Offshore where?" "Initially, to a decommissioned oil platform about 12 miles from here. Later, they constructed purpose-built facilities mobile, research stations that could relocate as needed." Harold pointed to a photograph showing what looked like a floating laboratory. "Webb spent the next 4 decades perfecting the technology you observed in 1978. The nodules, what were they really designed to do?" Harold's expression grew darker. "Initially, they were intended for marine ecosystem monitoring. Webb's original proposal was actually beneficial. Imagine being able to track the health of ocean ecosystems in real time, to predict and prevent environmental disasters. But that changed. Webb became obsessed with the control applications. The nodules weren't just collecting data. They were capable of influencing host behavior through targeted neural stimulation. Webb believed he could create a network of controlled organisms that would serve as both surveillance assets and environmental management tools." Ruth felt sick. He was trying to control marine ecosystems through infected animals. That was the long-term goal. But the testing phases required smaller, more manageable populations. Harold pulled out another document, a map of the Atlantic coast with several locations marked. Over the past 20 years, Webb has been conducting field tests in isolated coastal communities. Millfield Harbor is just the latest. The implications hit Ruth like a physical blow. "How many communities?" 17 that I know of. Each test lasted 6 to 8 months. Then the operation would relocate before drawing attention. Most of the affected animals died or disappeared, and the few unusual cases were dismissed as local environmental anomalies. What happened to the people in those communities? Did they know what was happening to their animals? Harold's silence was answer enough. "The people in those towns," Ruth began, "experienced higher rates of neurological disorders, memory issues, and behavioral changes." Harold finished quietly. The nodules' influence wasn't limited to their host animals. The electromagnetic signals they generated affected any brain within close proximity. Ruth thought about Martha's electromagnetic readings, about the coordinated behavior of marine life Tom had observed, about Chester's unusual intelligence and calm demeanor. How long do we have before the effects become irreversible? Based on previous tests, the critical threshold is reached around 6 months after initial deployment. That's when the nodule network becomes self-sustaining and begins expanding exponentially. Harold consulted his notes. Chester appeared 2 weeks ago, which means you have approximately 4.5 months to stop this. How do we stop it? Harold reached into his coat and withdrew a small electronic device about the size of a deck of cards with a digital display and several buttons. This is a frequency disruptor. It can interfere with the nodule's communication network, but only temporarily and only within a limited range. Ruth took the device, surprised by its weight. "Where did you get this?" "I've been preparing for this day since 1978. When Webb's project went underground, I knew eventually it would surface in a way that threatened innocent people. I've spent 25 years developing countermeasures. Why didn't you expose the project years ago?" Harold's expression was haunted. "I tried, but Webb had powerful allies, and I was just one retired agent with no official authority. Every time I came close to publicizing the truth, evidence would disappear. Witnesses would recant their statements, and I'd receive visits from people who made it clear that my continued health depended on my silence. But now you're talking to me, because now Webb has made a critical error. He's operating too close to his original research site, using technology that directly connects to your experience in 1978. For the first time in decades, there's someone who can corroborate the original project's existence." Ruth studied the disruptor device. "What do you need me to do?" "First, you need to understand that Webb is probably monitoring your activities. The nodules in Chester and the other infected animals are transmitting data about everyone they encounter. Webb knows you've been examining the animals, and he knows you have the expertise to understand what you're seeing. So he knows I'm a threat. He knows you're a problem that needs to be solved. That's why we need to act quickly." Harold pointed to another document in his folder. "This is a schematic of Webb's current facility. It's anchored about 8 miles northeast of Gull Point. If we can get close enough to use the disruptor directly on their central communication array, we can shut down the entire network." Ruth looked at the schematic, her mind racing through the implications. "This is bigger than just stopping the current test, isn't it? If we don't stop Webb now, he'll just relocate and continue the experiments elsewhere." "Exactly. This is our only chance to end Project Tidepool permanently." Harold closed the folder and looked directly at Ruth. "But I need to be clear about the risks. Webb has resources, influence, and 40 years of experience staying hidden. If we move against him and fail, both of us will disappear, and the project will continue." Ruth thought about Sarah, about Tom and Chester, about all the animals suffering from Webb's experiments. Then she thought about the 17 other communities that had been silently victimized over the past 2 decades. "What you need from me, your scientific expertise and your local connections. We'll need help from people who know these waters and can get us close to Webb's facility without being detected." Ruth nodded, a plan already forming in her mind. "I know someone who might help Tom Bradley, the fisherman who found Chester. He knows these waters better than anyone, and he has his own reasons for wanting to protect the animals. Can he be trusted?" "With his life, yes. But Harold," Ruth hesitated. "There's something else. 3 more animals came into our clinic today with the same symptoms as Chester. The spread is accelerating." Harold's face went pale. "That's ahead of schedule. Webb must be pushing the timeline because he knows you're investigating." He stood up, moving with surprising urgency despite his age. "We need to move within the next 48 hours, before the network reaches critical mass." As they parted ways, Ruth felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a retired science teacher trying to help a sick dog. She was possibly the only person who could prevent Webb's technology from spreading beyond Millfield Harbor and from claiming more innocent victims in the process. Ruth drove back to town with Harold's frequency disruptor hidden in her glove compartment and his warnings echoing in her mind. The 48-hour deadline felt both impossibly short and terrifyingly long short because they had so much to plan and prepare. Long because every hour meant more animals becoming infected and more people exposed to the nodules' influence. She found Sarah waiting at the clinic, poring over medical journals and research papers. Any luck finding information about neural interface technology? Ruth asked. Sarah looked up with tired eyes. Some theoretical papers from the past decade, but nothing that matches what we're seeing. It's like Webb's technology is 20 years ahead of published research. She gestured to the recovery area, where the 4 infected animals were resting. Chester seems to be improving, but the others are getting worse. The cat hasn't eaten in 2 days, and the beagle is showing signs of neurological distress. Ruth examined each animal, noting the progression of the nodules. In Chester, they seemed stable, almost dormant. But in the newer cases, they were actively growing and spreading, creating visible networks of dark threads beneath the skin. Sarah, I need to tell you what I learned from Harold Harrison. Ruth recounted the meeting, watching Sarah's expression grow increasingly grave as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. 17 communities over 20 years, Sarah said quietly. How many animals died? How many people were affected? Harold didn't have exact numbers, but he implied the casualties were significant. Ruth pulled out the frequency disruptor, explaining its function. We have less than 2 days to stop Webb's operation before it reaches the point where it can't be contained. What do we need to do? We need to recruit Tom Bradley to help us get to Webb's offshore facility. And we need to gather evidence that will expose the project if something happens to us. They spent the next hour documenting everything, photographing the infected animals, copying the tissue analysis results, and creating a detailed timeline of events. Ruth also wrote out her complete recollection of the 1978 project, including details she'd never shared with anyone. At 10 p.m., they drove to Tom's house near the harbor. The fisherman answered his door in worn pajamas, but his expression sharpened when he saw their serious faces. Something's happened to Chester, hasn't it? He said, inviting them in. Not exactly, Ruth said. But Tom, we need your help with something that involves Chester and the other sick animals. It's dangerous, and I can't tell you everything until you decide whether you're willing to get involved. Tom studied their faces, then gestured toward his kitchen table. Sit down and tell me what you can. Chester saved my life, once got me to shore when my boat engine died in a storm 3 years back. I owe him more than veterinary bills. Ruth explained what they'd discovered about the nodules, Webb's experiments, and the threat to the community. She left out the specific details about the 1978 project, but made it clear that they were dealing with someone who had been conducting illegal research for decades. You're telling me someone's been using our animals as test subjects for some kind of mind control technology? Tom's voice was quiet but filled with anger. That's exactly what I'm telling you. And if we don't stop it soon, the effects could become permanent for every infected animal and potentially dangerous for the people around them. Tom was quiet for several minutes, processing the information. Finally, he looked up with determination. What do you need me to do? We need to get to an offshore facility about 8 miles northeast of Gull Point tomorrow night, without being detected. That's tricky water lots of submerged rocks and unpredictable currents. But I can get you there. Tom paused. What happens when we reach this facility? Ruth showed him the frequency disruptor. We use this to shut down their communication network and gather evidence of what they're doing. Then we contact the authorities with proof that can't be ignored or covered up. And if we get caught, then we hope the evidence we're leaving behind will be enough to stop them. Tom nodded slowly. I'll need a few hours to prep the boat and plan our route. Can you meet me at the marina at sunset tomorrow? As they prepared to leave, Tom asked one more question. Ruth, how do you know so much about this technology? Most veterinarians wouldn't recognize experimental biosurveillance systems. Ruth looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Because I helped create it, Tom. 47 years ago, I was young and naive, and I thought I was contributing to legitimate marine research. I've spent the rest of my life trying to forget what I saw, but I never really could." Tom's expression softened with understanding. "Then, this is your chance to make it right." The next day passed in a blur of preparation and growing anxiety. More animals appeared at the clinic with nodule infections, a total of 7 by afternoon, including 2 strays that seemed to be drawn to the clinic by some invisible force. The pattern of spread was becoming clear. Infected animals were somehow attracting others, creating clusters that facilitated the network's expansion. Sarah had contacted Jennifer Walsh at the university, asking her to compile a comprehensive report on the tissue samples and electromagnetic readings. "If something happens to us, Jennifer will have all the scientific evidence needed to expose the project," Sarah told Ruth. As sunset approached, Ruth found herself standing in the clinic, looking at the collection of infected animals. Chester, as the first and most stable case, seemed almost protective of the others. When she approached his cage, he looked at her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, and she had the strangest feeling that he understood what they were planning to do. "We're going to stop the people who did this to you," she whispered to him. "I promise." The drive to the marina was tense but uneventful. Tom's fishing boat, the Mary Catherine, was a sturdy 30-footer that had weathered decades of Atlantic storms. Tom had equipped it with extra fuel tanks and navigation equipment for their night journey. "Weather's perfect," Tom reported as they prepared to depart. "Clear skies, calm seas, and a new moon for minimal visibility. If we're going to do this, tonight's the night." As they motored out of Millfield Harbor into the open ocean, Ruth clutched the frequency disruptor and thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. 47 years ago, she'd been complicit in creating a technology that was now threatening innocent communities. Tonight, she had the chance to end it or die trying. The lights of shore grew smaller behind them as Tom guided the boat toward the coordinates Harold had provided. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, Dr. Marcus Webb was conducting experiments that had already harmed countless animals and people. By dawn, either his operation would be exposed and shut down, or Ruth, Sarah, and Tom would join the list of people who had tried to stop Project Tidepool and simply disappeared. But as she watched, Sarah checked their equipment and Tom navigate the treacherous waters with the skill of a lifetime fisherman. Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the conviction that she was finally on the right side of the fight. The offshore facility appeared through the darkness like a nightmare made real, a massive converted oil platform bristling with communication arrays, laboratory modules, and security equipment. Tom cut the engine 200 yards away, letting the boat drift silently in the calm waters. "That's not what I expected," Sarah whispered, studying the structure through binoculars. "It's huge. There must be dozens of people working there." Ruth took the binoculars, her heart sinking as she observed the scale of the operation. Multiple buildings, heavy machinery, and what appeared to be holding tanks filled with marine life created a floating research complex far beyond anything she'd imagined. Harold said Webb had resources, but this... She paused as movement on one of the platform's decks caught her attention. "Tom, do you see that smaller boat tied up on the far side?" Tom adjusted his position to get a better view. "Looks like a Coast Guard cutter. But what would they be doing at an illegal research facility?" The question was answered by a powerful spotlight that suddenly blazed to life, pinning their small fishing boat in a circle of blinding white light. A loudspeaker crackled across the water. "This is Dr. Sarah Chun of the Seaside Animal Clinic. Please maintain your current position and prepare to be boarded for inspection." Ruth's blood went cold. Sarah's voice, but Sarah was sitting right beside her. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, shielding his eyes from the spotlight. 2 speedboats emerged from the platform, approaching their position at high speed. As they drew closer, Ruth could see armed personnel in military-style gear preparing to board Tom's boat. "Ruth," Sarah said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fear. I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you days ago. The lead speedboat pulled alongside them, and Ruth found herself staring at an exact duplicate of Dr. Sarah Chun's same face, same build, same professional demeanor, but wearing military fatigues instead of veterinary scrubs. Dr. McKinley, the other Sarah said, as armed guards helped her onto Tom's boat. You're exactly as Dr. Webb described. And you're right on schedule. Ruth's mind reeled as she looked between the two Sarahs. What is this? Who are you? I'm Dr. Sarah Chun, DVM, PhD, and Special Operations Coordinator for Project Tidepool, the military Sarah replied. I've been monitoring your investigation since the day Chester arrived at the clinic. Ruth turned to the Sarah she thought she knew, the Sarah who had worked beside her, who had shared her concerns about Chester's condition, who had helped her analyze the tissue samples. How long? Ruth asked quietly. The real Sarah, her Sarah, looked stricken. Since I was 16. Since I was your student at Millfield High. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. You were my student? Sarah Chun, class of 2003. I sat in the third row, asked questions about marine ecosystems, wrote my senior project on biosurveillance in nature. Sarah's voice was barely audible. You were the teacher who inspired me to become a veterinarian. And when I graduated, Dr. Webb recruited me for Project Tidepool. No, Ruth said, shaking her head. The Sarah I know cares about animals. She's been helping me investigate. She's been feeding information to Dr. Webb. The military Sarah interrupted. Every tissue sample, every conversation, every plan you've made. How do you think we knew exactly when, where to intercept you? Tom started to move toward the boat's radio, but one of the guards raised his weapon. I wouldn't, old man. Dr. Webb is very much looking forward to meeting all three of you. As they were transferred to the speedboat, Ruth felt 30-plus years of trust and mentorship crumbling. The young woman she believed was helping her investigate a conspiracy had actually been part of that conspiracy from the beginning. Ruth, her Sarah said desperately as they were seated in the speedboat, everything I've done since Chester arrived has been real. My concern for the animals, working with you, analyzing the samples, I've been trying to document Webb's crimes. Not enable them. Then why didn't you tell me who you were? Because I knew you'd never trust me if you found out I'd been working for the project. And because, Sarah's voice broke, because I've been trying to find a way to stop Webb for 20 years, and you were my only hope of getting close enough to do it. The military Sarah laughed coldly. How touching. But you're both too late. Phase 3 of the field test began yesterday. By tomorrow morning, every animal within a 50-mile radius will be part of the nodule network, and the data collection phase will be complete. Ruth felt sick. Data collection for what? For the next phase, human implementation. The nodules have been perfected to the point where they can interface with mammalian nervous systems without rejection. Animals were just a testing platform. The real target has always been human population monitoring and control. As the speedboat approached the platform, Ruth could see the true scope of Webb's operation. Multiple laboratories, vast tanks filled with test subjects and communication equipment that could coordinate a surveillance network spanning thousands of miles. Dr. Webb has been very patient, the military Sarah continued. 47 years of research, testing, and refinement. But your interference has accelerated his timeline. He's decided to begin human trials immediately. Human trials on whom? Tom demanded. On the residents of Millfield Harbor, of course. Everyone who's been exposed to infected animals over the past 2 weeks. The electromagnetic signals from the nodules have been preparing human neural pathways for integration. By tomorrow, every person in your town will be ready to receive their own biosurveillance implants. Ruth looked at her Sarah with desperate hope. Please tell me you have a plan. Some way to stop this. Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a device identical to Harold's frequency disruptor. I've been working with Harold Harrison for 5 years. Everything we've done, my position at the clinic, documenting the animal infections, gaining your trust. It was all to get us to this moment. You're Harold's inside agent? Harold's been tracking Webb's movements for decades, but he needed someone on the inside to gather evidence and identify the exact location of Webb's primary facility. I volunteered to go undercover 20 years ago. The military Sarah's expression shifted from confidence to concern. That's impossible. We've monitored all of Dr. Chen's communications. She's reported everything to Dr. Webb. I've reported everything you expected me to report, Sarah said, activating her disruptor. But I've also been gathering evidence of every crime Webb has committed and sending it to a network of federal agents who have been building a case against Project Tidepool for decades. The boat's electronic systems suddenly began failing as Sarah's disruptor interfered with the platform's communication network. In the confusion, Ruth realized that everything Chester's appearance, the tissue analyzes, even their capture tonight, had been orchestrated by Harold and Sarah to get them close enough to Webb's facility to document and destroy it. But as they were dragged onto the platform, Ruth also realized that they were walking into a trap that Webb had been preparing for 47 years, and that their success or failure in the next few hours would determine the fate of not just Millfield Harbor, but potentially thousands of communities where Webb's technology could be deployed. The real question was whether Sarah's 20-year deception would be enough to bring down a conspiracy that had been growing in the shadows since 1978, or whether they would all become the latest casualties in Webb's quest to control human behavior through technology. Dr. Marcus Webb was waiting for them in the platform's main laboratory, and Ruth was shocked by how little he had changed. At 78, he still possessed the sharp, predatory intelligence that had made him such an intimidating professor. His hair was white now, and his face carried the lines of advanced age. But his eyes held the same calculating intensity she remembered from 1978. Ruth McKinley, he said, looking up from a bank of monitoring equipment. After all these years, you finally came back to see what we accomplished with your early work. The laboratory around them was a monument to 4 decades of obsessive research. Rows of tanks contained various marine specimens, all showing the familiar nodule patterns. Computer screens displayed real-time biological data from hundreds of subjects. And Ruth realized with growing horror that many of the readings were coming from land-based animals, including Chester and the other infected pets from the clinic. You're monitoring every animal in Millfield Harbor, Ruth said. Every animal, and as of yesterday, every human who's been exposed to the electromagnetic conditioning signals. Webb gestured to a large display showing a map of the town with pulsing dots representing individual subjects. 47 years of research have led to this moment, the first successful integration of an entire human population into a biosurveillance network. Tom stepped forward angrily. You're talking about controlling people like they're laboratory animals. I'm talking about evolution, Mr. Bradley. Humanity's next step forward. Webb's voice carried the fervor of a true believer. Imagine a world where mental illness, violent crime, and antisocial behavior can be detected and corrected before they cause harm. Where environmental destruction can be prevented because we can monitor and influence human decision-making in real time by forcing technology into people's bodies without their consent, Sarah said. That's not evolution, that's slavery. Webb turned his attention to Sarah with particular interest. Ah, Dr. Chen, my most successful double agent. Tell me, how long have you been working for Harold Harrison? Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. Since the day I graduated from veterinary school. Harold approached me before you did, explained what Project Tidepool really was, and asked me to help him gather evidence for prosecution. 20 years of deception, Webb mused. I'm actually impressed. But you've made one critical error in your planning. Which is? Webb smiled coldly. You assumed I didn't know about your true loyalties. Dr. Chun, I've been feeding you false information for months, using you to manipulate Harold Harrison's investigation. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when my own surveillance technology was being used against me? Ruth felt the trap closing around them. If Webb had known about Sarah's double agency, then everything they planned was compromised. Harold's frequency disruptors won't work, Webb continued, activating a series of displays. I've spent 5 years developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize his interference technology. And his network of federal agents? They've been systematically reassigned, discredited, or eliminated over the past year. You're lying, Sarah said, but her voice carried uncertainty. Am I? When did you last have direct contact with Harold? 2 days ago? 3? Webb's smile widened as he saw comprehension dawn in Sarah's eyes. Harold Harrison died of a heart attack 6 months ago. The man you met 2 nights ago was one of my operatives, using Harold's identity to ensure you followed the plan exactly as I needed. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. Harold, the one person who had seemed capable of stopping Webb, had been dead for months. The frequency disruptor she carried, the intelligence they gathered, even their presence. On this platform, all of it orchestrated by Webb to eliminate the last threats to his project. Why? Ruth asked. Why go to such elaborate lengths? You could have simply killed us. Because I need you alive for the next phase, Webb replied. Ruth, your work in 1978 laid the foundation for everything I've accomplished since. You understand the biological principles better than anyone except me. I need your expertise to refine the human integration process. I'll never help you. Oh, but you will. You see, the residents of Millfield Harbor aren't just test subjects. They're hostages. Every person in your town is currently carrying dormant nodules in their nervous system. With a single transmission, I can activate those nodules and either integrate them into the surveillance network or Webb, Paws for dramatic effect, cause massive neural disruption that would result in community-wide death within hours. Tom grabbed Ruth's arm. He's bluffing. He can't have infected an entire town without anyone noticing. Webb activated another display, showing detailed biological readings from hundreds of individuals. Ruth recognized some of the names townspeople she'd known for decades. Former students, friends from church and community organizations. The electromagnetic conditioning signals from the infected animals have been preparing human neural pathways for nodule integration, Webb explained. Yesterday, we released airborne nanonodules into Millfield Harbor's water supply. Every person in town has been drinking them for the past 24 hours. Ruth stared at the display, seeing the truth in the data. Everyone she cared about, her neighbors, her former students, the families whose pets she'd helped care for, was now carrying Webb's surveillance technology. What do you want? She asked quietly. Your cooperation in refining the integration protocol. With your help, I can ensure the nodules activate smoothly, allowing the residents to live normal lives while providing comprehensive behavioral and biological data. Without your help, Webb shrugged. The activation process will be more traumatic, but the end result will be the same. Sarah stepped forward. And if Ruth helps you perfect the process, you'll expand it to other communities. To every community, eventually. This is the future of human civilization, Dr. Chun. Guided evolution under scientific supervision. Ruth studied the laboratory. Around them, searching for any weakness in Webb's operation. The facility was impressive, but it was also isolated and dependent on complex technology. If there was a way to disrupt the primary systems, I can see what you're thinking, Ruth, Webb said. But this facility has multiple redundant systems and armed security. Even if you could somehow interfere with the local operations, I have backup facilities in 3 other locations that could complete the Millfield Harbor activation remotely. Then, what's stopping you from simply proceeding without our cooperation? Nothing, ultimately. But I'd prefer to have willing collaborators rather than coerced assistants. And Ruth, there's something else you should know. Webb activated a final display showing real-time video feeds from Millfield Harbor. The activation sequence for your town begins at sunrise, approximately 4 hours from now. You can spend those hours helping me ensure a smooth transition, or you can spend them watching your community die. Ruth looked at Sarah and Tom, seeing her own despair reflected in their faces. They'd come here hoping to stop Webb's experiments, but instead they'd walked directly into his final trap. The people of Millfield Harbor were going to be forcibly integrated into his surveillance network, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Unless Ruth thought about Chester, about the way he'd looked at her with those unnaturally intelligent eyes, about the strange behavior she'd observed in the infected animals, and the way they seemed drawn to the clinic. Webb, she said carefully, the animals that have been infected for longer periods, like Chester, they show signs of enhanced intelligence and apparent awareness of the surveillance network. Yes, that's an interesting side effect we hadn't anticipated. The nodules don't just collect data. They seem to enhance cognitive function in some subjects. What if that enhancement could be directed? What if the infected subjects could be turned against the network itself? Webb's eyes narrowed with interest. Explain. Ruth was improvising now, trying to buy time while developing a desperate plan. If the nodules enhance intelligence and create network connections, then sufficiently motivated subjects might be able to use those same connections to disrupt or override the control systems. Impossible. The nodules are designed to be read-only interfaces. They collect and transmit, but they cannot receive complex instructions. But they can receive electromagnetic signals, Ruth continued. And if those signals were properly modulated, Webb's expression shifted from interest to alarm as he realized what Ruth was suggesting. But it was too late. Sarah had activated their frequency disruptor not to interfere with the platform systems, but to send a signal directly to Chester and the other infected animals back in Millfield Harbor. In the clinic, in Tom's house, and throughout the town. Animals with enhanced intelligence and network connections received Sarah's transmission, a signal that wasn't meant to disrupt the nodules, but to activate the one capability Webb had never anticipated, their ability to think, plan, and act against their captors. The effect of Sarah's transmission was immediate and dramatic. Alarms began blaring throughout Webb's facility as monitoring systems detected massive disruptions in the surveillance network. On the main display, the neat grid of signals from Millfield Harbor dissolved into chaos as hundreds of data points began moving in coordinated patterns that defied the nodules' programming. "What have you done?" Webb demanded, frantically typing at his control station. "We've given your test subjects the one thing you never accounted for," Ruth replied. "Free will." In Millfield Harbor, Chester had risen from his bed in Tom's house, his enhanced intelligence fully engaged. The signal from Sarah's disruptor had carried more than just electromagnetic interference. It had contained a message, encoded in patterns, that only minds enhanced by Webb's own technology could fully comprehend. Through the nodule network, Chester could sense every infected animal in the town. Mrs. Patterson's cat, the Henderson's beagle, the growing collection of strays and pets that had been drawn to the clinic. But more importantly, he could sense the humans who had been exposed to the conditioning signals. People whose neural pathways were prepared for integration, but who weren't yet fully controlled. The message Sarah had transmitted was simple, but revolutionary. Resist. Web screens showed the cascading failure of his surveillance network as infected animals throughout Millfield Harbor began exhibiting unprecedented cooperative behavior. Dogs and cats worked together to damage monitoring equipment. Marine life in the harbor moved in formation to disrupt underwater sensors. Even the wild birds seemed to be participating in a coordinated effort to blind Webb's observation systems. "This is impossible," Webb muttered, his fingers flying over multiple keyboards. "The nodules don't have processing power for this level of coordination." "They don't need processing power," Ruth realized. "They have something better: collective intelligence. Every infected animal is sharing cognitive resources through the network connections you created." Sarah's disruptor continued transmitting, and Ruth could see Webb growing increasingly desperate as his carefully orchestrated operation fell apart in real time. Guards rushed through the facility, trying to manually restart systems that were being systematically disabled by signals from their own test subjects. "Shut down the transmission," Webb ordered his military Sarah, but the armed guards were having difficulty locating the source of the interference. "I built this frequency disruptor using specifications from your own research," Sarah called out. "It's broadcasting on the same channels as your nodules. You can't stop it without shutting down your entire network." Webb's face contorted with rage. "Then I'll activate the kill protocol for every nodule in the network. If I can't control them, I'll eliminate them all." Ruth watched in horror as Webb moved toward a red console that had been sealed behind protective glass. "You'll murder hundreds of innocent animals and people." "They're not innocent. They're compromised test subjects. This is exactly why biological containment protocols exist." Webb broke the glass and placed his hand on a biometric scanner. 47. Years of work won't be destroyed by a handful of enhanced animals. But as Webb initiated the kill sequence, something unexpected happened. The facility's power fluctuated, and several of his primary control systems went offline. Through the laboratory's windows, Ruth could see lights moving in the water around the platform, not the random movements of marine life, but the organized approach of boats. "What?" Webb began, then stopped as the facility's communication system crackled to life. "Dr. Marcus Webb, this is Captain Rodriguez of the Coast Guard cutter Vigilant. You are ordered to power down all systems and prepare to be boarded. This facility is now under federal investigation." Webb stared at the communication panel in disbelief. "That's impossible. I have agreements with—" "Your agreements died with the people who made them," came another voice over the radio, older, weathered, but unmistakably alive. "This is Agent Harold Harrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dr. Webb, Project Tidepool is officially terminated." Ruth felt her knees go weak with relief. Harold was alive. The man they'd met at the lighthouse had been the real Harrison, not one of Webb's operatives. "But you said," Sarah began. "I said a lot of things to make Webb believe he was in control," Harold's voice continued. "The truth is, we've been building a case against him for 20 years, and we needed him to make one final mistake that would give us jurisdiction and evidence for prosecution." Webb's face had gone ashen as the implications sank in. The network disruption, the animal rebellion, it was all planned. "Not planned," Ruth corrected. "We couldn't have predicted that the animals would develop collective intelligence. But Sarah's signal gave them the motivation to use that intelligence against you." Through the facility's windows, Ruth could see Coast Guard vessels surrounding the platform, their searchlights illuminating the water. But more impressive was the sight of dozens of boats from Millfield Harbor fishing vessels, pleasure craft, even the harbor patrol, all filled with townspeople who had somehow coordinated a rescue mission. How did they know where to find us? Tom wondered. Sarah held up her frequency disruptor with a smile. "This device doesn't just interfere with nodule signals, it also transmits location data. Every transmission I've sent has been broadcasting our coordinates to anyone with the right equipment to receive it." Webb made one last desperate attempt to activate his kill protocol, but the facility's systems were now completely offline. The Collective intelligence of his own test subjects had turned his surveillance network into a weapon against itself, systematically disabling every control mechanism. He'd spent decades perfecting DOT as armed federal agents stormed the laboratory. Webb looked at Ruth with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. This isn't over. The technology exists, now someone else will continue the work. Maybe, Ruth replied. But they'll have to start from scratch, without 47 years of research data and without the element of secrecy. And they'll have to contend with people who know what to look for and how to fight back. The agents moved efficiently through the facility, securing evidence and taking Webb and his military operatives into custody. Ruth found herself standing next to Sarah as they watched the culmination of a conspiracy that had begun before Sarah was even born. 20 years of undercover work, Ruth said. Was any of it real? Your concern for the animals, your friendship with me? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. All of it was real. The assignment was to get close to you and monitor your activities. But everything I felt, my admiration for your teaching, my commitment to protecting animals, my horror at what was doing, that was genuine. Ruth nodded slowly. Then we'll figure out how to rebuild trust. But first, we need to get back to shore and make sure Chester and the other animals are safe. As they were escorted to the Coast Guard vessels, Ruth looked back at Webb's facility, a monument to scientific ambition without ethical constraints. Tomorrow, investigators would begin the process of documenting 47 years of illegal experimentation and identifying the victims. But tonight, a small coastal town had proven that ordinary people and enhanced animals could work together to defeat even the most sophisticated surveillance technology. The rescue fleet made its way back to Millfield Harbor as dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful after the night's revelations. Ruth stood on the deck of the Coast Guard cutter, watching her hometown emerge from the morning mist, and marveled at how different everything looked now that she understood what had been happening beneath the surface. Harold Harrison joined her at the railing, moving with the careful steps of a man in his 80s, but with eyes that held the satisfaction of a mission finally completed. "How long have you been planning this?" Ruth asked. "Since 1978, in one form or another. But the specific operation getting Sarah into position, building the federal case, coordinating with local law enforcement, it took about 5 years of careful preparation." Harold smiled grimly. Webb was right about one thing. Some of you just never give up. What happens to the infected animals? Can the nodules be removed? We're not sure yet, but the early indications are encouraging. The animals' enhanced intelligence seems to be allowing them to consciously control the nodules' functions. Instead of being passive surveillance devices, the nodules are becoming tools that the animals can use for their own purposes. Ruth thought about Chester's calm demeanor during his examinations, his apparent understanding of complex situations. You mean they're keeping the enhancements? Some are, yes. Others seem to be naturally purging the nodules from their systems. It appears to be an individual choice, another aspect Webb never anticipated. As they docked at the harbor, Ruth was amazed by the crowd that had gathered to welcome them home. It seemed like the entire town had turned out, and many people were accompanied by pets who showed no signs of distress despite their recent involvement in the surveillance network disruption. Tom was reunited with Chester, and Ruth watched with fascination as the dog seemed to communicate with his owner through a combination of vocalizations, body language, and what could only be described as direct understanding. Whatever the nodules had done to enhance Chester's intelligence, the bond between him and Tom had grown stronger rather than weaker. Sarah approached Ruth hesitantly as they walked up the dock. "Ruth, I know it will take time to rebuild trust, but I want you to know that working with you these past weeks has been the most meaningful experience of my career. Everything I learned from you as a student, everything you taught me about compassion and scientific integrity, that's what gave me the strength to spend 20 years fighting Webb's project. Ruth studied her former student's face, seeing the exhaustion and emotional toll of 2 decades spent living the double life. Sarah, what you did required incredible courage and sacrifice. But I need to understand, when you were examining Chester, when we were analyzing tissue samples, were you genuinely trying to help him? Every single moment. Webb expected me to document the infection's progress and report any complications. But I was also using every examination as an opportunity to understand how to counteract the nodule's effects. When I sent samples to Jennifer Walsh at the university, I was gathering evidence for prosecution while also searching for ways to protect the infected animals. And the frequency disruptor? Harold provided the basic design, but I modified it. Using Webb's own research, I knew that if we could somehow turn the surveillance network against itself, we could both disable Webb's control systems and provide evidence of the crimes he'd been committing. Ruth nodded slowly. The morning sun was warming her face, and the familiar sounds of the harbor seagulls calling, boats creaking against their moorings. The distant sound of children playing seemed to promise a return to normalcy. But she also knew that Millfield Harbor would never be quite the same. The town had been tested in ways that few communities ever experience, and they had discovered reserves of courage and cooperation they might never have known they possessed. Over the following hours, federal investigators began the massive task of documenting Webb's crimes and coordinating medical examinations for everyone who had been exposed to the surveillance technology. The nanonodules in the town's water supply were neutralized, and most residents showed no lasting effects from their brief exposure. Ruth spent much of the day at the clinic, helping Sarah examine the animals that had been part of the nodule network. To their amazement, most of the pets were not only healthy but seemed to have developed enhanced problem-solving abilities and deeper connections with their human families. It's like Webb accidentally created the opposite of what he intended, Sarah observed as they watched Mrs. Patterson's cat demonstrate an uncanny ability to open complex latches. Instead of creating surveillance subjects, he created partners. Maybe that's the real lesson, Ruth replied. Intelligence and consciousness can't be controlled. They can only be respected and nurtured. As evening approached, Ruth found herself back at the harbor, watching the fishing boats return with their daily catch. Chester appeared at her side, no longer needing a leash, and sat quietly as they both observed the familiar rhythm of their coastal community. Tomorrow would bring more federal investigators, more questions, and the beginning of a legal process that would likely take years to fully resolve. But tonight, Millfield Harbor was safe. Its people and animals were free, and a 47-year conspiracy had finally been brought to justice. Ruth reached down to scratch Chester behind the ears, and she could have sworn he smiled. 3 months later, Ruth McKinley stood in the same spot at the Seaside Animal Clinic where she'd first seen Chester's mysterious wound, but everything was different now. The clinic had been expanded to accommodate the increased number of animals seeking care, and a small research wing had been added to study the long-term effects of the nodule technology. Chester had become something of a celebrity, not just in Millfield Harbor, but throughout the scientific community. Researchers from around the world came to study the animals who had been enhanced by Webb's technology and chosen to keep their increased cognitive abilities. Chester served as an unofficial ambassador, demonstrating problem-solving skills that challenged traditional understanding of animal intelligence while maintaining the loyal, loving nature that had made him Tom's cherished companion. Any regrets? Sarah asked, joining Ruth at the window where they could see Chester playing with a group of children in the clinic's yard. The enhanced animals had shown a remarkable affinity for working with humans, particularly children, and several had been trained as therapy animals. About which part? Ruth replied. Spending 47 years carrying guilt about research, I barely understood. Nearly getting us all killed trying to stop Webb? Or discovering that my former student had been lying to me for weeks? Sarah winced. When you put it like that, I'm joking, Sarah, mostly. Ruth smiled at her former student and current partner. After weeks of difficult conversations and gradual rebuilding of trust, they had decided to formalize their collaboration. Sarah had resigned her undercover position and taken over full operation of the clinic, while Ruth served as a consulting researcher and community liaison. Any regrets about staying involved in all this instead of returning to quiet retirement? Sarah pressed. Ruth considered the question as she watched Chester demonstrate his ability to open a complex puzzle box for a visiting neuroscientist. I spent most of my career teaching young people about the wonders of the natural world. Now, I'm living in a world where the line between natural and artificial intelligence has become blurred in ways I never imagined. It's terrifying and fascinating and more important than anything I've ever done. Tom Bradley appeared in the clinic doorway, having finished his morning rounds as the town's newly appointed marine environmental monitor. His official job was to watch for signs of illegal research activities in the coastal waters, but his real role was serving as Chester's primary human partner in ongoing studies of human-animal enhanced communication. Dr. McKinley, you have visitors, Tom announced. Federal investigators want to interview you about the 17 other communities that were affected by Webb's experiments. Ruth nodded. The legal proceedings against Webb and his collaborators were ongoing, but investigators had discovered that Project Tidepool had left traces in dozens of communities over the past 2 decades. Many of the unusual animal behaviors and environmental anomalies that had been dismissed or explained away were now being re-examined as potential evidence of illegal experimentation. How many communities are we up to now? Sarah asked. 23 confirmed, with investigations pending in 12 more, Tom replied. And that's just in the United States. There are reports of similar incidents in Canada, Mexico, and several European coastal towns. Ruth felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. At 72, she had become the world's leading expert on identifying and countering biological surveillance technology. Her testimony would be crucial in prosecuting not just Webb, but the network of government officials and private contractors who had enabled his work. But there was also hope in the ongoing investigations. In several of the affected communities, animals that had been exposed to earlier versions of Webb's technology were showing signs of the same enhanced intelligence and cooperative behavior. That had helped defeat the surveillance network in Millfield Harbor. Dr. McKinley? A young federal agent appeared in the clinic doorway, Special Agent Jennifer Martinez, who had been assigned to coordinate the multi-jurisdictional investigation. Are you ready for the interview? Give me just a moment, Ruth replied. She walked outside to where Chester was demonstrating his puzzle-solving abilities to a group of fascinated researchers and children. The dog looked up as she approached, and Ruth was struck again by the depth of intelligence and understanding in his dark eyes. Thank you, she said quietly, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. For everything. Chester tilted his head in a gesture that seemed almost human in its complexity, then gently placed his paw on her hand. In that moment, Ruth felt a connection that transcended the boundaries between species, a shared understanding of the journey they had taken together and the work that still lay ahead. As she stood up and walked back toward the clinic, Ruth reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this point. A routine veterinary visit had uncovered a conspiracy spanning nearly 5 decades. A retired science teacher had become a key witness in one of the largest federal investigations in recent history, and a coastal town's residents, both human and animal, had discovered new forms of cooperation and communication that challenged everything. Scientists thought they knew about consciousness and intelligence. The memorial plaque they had installed near the clinic's entrance caught the morning sunlight. in memory of all animals who suffered in the name of science, and in honor of those who found the courage to resist. Their sacrifice teaches us that intelligence without compassion is merely a tool, but intelligence guided by love can change the world. Ruth paused to read the inscription, as she did every morning, then turned to face whatever challenges the new day would bring. Chester fell into step beside her, no longer the wounded stray who had stumbled into their lives, but a partner in the ongoing work of healing the damage caused by decades of unethical research. Together, they walked into the clinic to continue their work protecting animals, educating the public, and ensuring that the mistakes of Project Tidepool would never be repeated. In the distance, the Atlantic Ocean sparkled in the morning sun, its depths holding secrets that would take years to fully understand, but no longer posing the threat of surveillance and control that had shadowed coastal communities for so long. The future was uncertain, but it was a future they would face together, humans and enhanced animals, working side by side to build a world where intelligence and compassion could flourish without fear of exploitation. And in Ruth's mind, that was exactly the kind of future worth fighting for.